Hello, everyone. David Morris here, publisher of Lake Drive Books, where we publish books that help you heal, grow, and discover. And I am joined today by esteemed, let me just say esteemed author and love professor as well, Frank Rogers Jr. Good to be with you, Frank. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here. And let me just say, it has been such a deep joy working with you. Lake
Oh,
Drive has been amazing. So
thank
thank you.
you. Thank you.
Couldn't have a
Likewise.
better home for my book.
Yay. Yeah, I love it. And more to come, and it will just continue. Yeah. That's one of the joys of publishing, I think, or when the relationships can be long term. Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. Well,
Whether you feel a kinship with, and there's a
yeah.
kind that emanates from you and your dedication to your authors and the kinds of books that you try to publish. I mean, I just feel it, that kinship right away. So
Thank you, thank you. Well, hey, I'm supposed to be interviewing you and talking about you, but that's yes, and that's something we want that to flow both ways. Thank you. Um, well, you've got an amazing book. As we are recording this, it's coming out in a matter of just about a month. And it's called Cradled in the Arms of Compassion, a spiritual journey from trauma to recovery. And it is really quite a life's work for you, but it's not just a magnum opus. It's not just a giant, or it's not just an autobiography. It is a book that offers a lot of wisdom and insight that through a process of discovery that you went through over decades, really. But enough of me trying to talk about it. Let me ask you first, though, Frank. What's your day job? What do you normally do?
Yeah. My day job, I'm a professor of spiritual formation and narrative pedagogy at the Claremont School of Theology, an interfaith school here. And I also co-direct the Center for Engaged Compassion. My avocation, I'm also a spiritual director. So I do a lot of kind of counseling and companioning with people on their spiritual journeys, and have a very active practice in that regard, and do a lot of workshops and retreats around compassion-based ways of restoring ourselves and reconnecting with our loved ones.
I bet that translates into a lot of really on the ground kind of stories and understandings. And when you talk about the word compassion, that sounds very, you know, kind of intangible in a way. It's a big word. It's a long word. But how does that translate into the everyday work?
Yeah, well, I mean, personally, I think compassion is kind of the heartbeat of humanity. I mean, it's compassion is really being able to connect with another person empathically, to care about them, and to want to be an instrument that helps them along a little bit, whether it celebrates their joys or eases their suffering a little bit, and that's the glue of any relationship, a relationship with ourselves, a relationship with our loved ones, relationship with people in our world.
Mm, mm. And people who come to like your retreats, what are they looking for? What are they looking for to take back into their lives, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think a couple things. I mean, first of all, I think that when we are in our best selves, when we are kind of in our grounded center, that we have our capacities for connection and compassion and clarity and calmness. But we so often are not there. We're kind of driven by our emotions. We're driven by our impulses, our behaviors, the fantasies that take over in our minds, the self-talk. And
Mm-hmm.
so, what people come for, first of all, is to find some freedom from that inner cacophony. And we've developed a very self-compassion based ways of tending to our inner world, and finding a little inner peace and kind of restoring ourselves in our best self. And then from there, how do we tend to the relationships in our lives in ways that really are mutually satisfying? And compassion is really at the heart of that too.
Yeah. It's almost like it's more of a spiritual discipline word um, than it is a practical psychological word, for example. Like mindfulness. How would you compare compassion with mindfulness, for example?
Well, I think mindfulness is a big part of it. So mindfulness is kind of being able to find that grounded center in oneself, where I could be mindful of my emotions. I can be mindful of my impulses to act in a certain way, but I'm not dictated by them anymore. So it's like that grounded awareness. And being able to do that within ourselves is one step towards kind of getting back into our best self. But what compassion does beyond that is those inner cacophonies, those emotions and whatnot, they actually are rooted in something really important. They mean well for us. They're rooted in some deep need that wants attention, or something that's really at stake for us. And so if we go beyond mindfulness to a compassionate connection, like to a heartfulness towards our inner world, it opens ourselves to seeing the beauty of where our emotions come from, our impulses, and then we can tend to them in ways that are really restorative.
Nice. Gotcha. Yeah. Catching on. I don't want to try to compress an entire retreat into a single video interview here. Thank you for that. But, okay, so that word is in the title of your book, Cradled in the Arms of Compassion. Tell us about your book. How does it get to that word compassion? What happens in your book?
Yeah, well, like you said, I mean, my book is really coming out of my lifelong journey of trying to find that inner peace. I'm a sexual abuse survivor, and so, my teenage years and young adult years were really at the mercy of just the cacophony of shames and rages and nightmares and inner turmoil that really led to really self-destructive behavior, everything from cutting to suicidality. And that prompted for me a quest to, I needed to find some psycho-spiritual resources, some ways of just surviving. And so everything from different types of therapies to spiritual practices to meditations to every art classes, I mean, everything that you could imagine, I just went searching for them to see what would help me tend to all of the turmoil inside of me, and began to discover different practices and ways of being that really helped me heal the deep wounds within me, helped heal the shame that I was carrying, helped me navigate the impulsive behaviors that would want to erupt out of me, and gradually kind of restored me back to my best self. And at the heart of being able to tend to all that inner chaos was learning to have compassion for my inner experience instead of judging it, shaming it, wishing it would go away, trying to fix it, manipulate it, suppress it through contemplative practice or something. Instead of fighting it, it's like, you know what? I feel this way for a reason. All of this stuff is something that wants to be held and tended, and treating myself in that inner world like I would treat a good friend who came to me with the same struggles.
Yeah.
Hey, tell me about it. Let me hear and understand. And that became tremendously liberative and restorative for me.
I think all of us are somewhere on that same continuum as human beings. We all have suffering in our background that we've not been able to acknowledge, that we don't recognize, and that's perhaps the process of becoming whole, is being able to see those things. In your case, as someone who's read your book, I could see, okay, you got an unfair dose. And I think it's one thing to talk about childhood sexual abuse and the way that manifests itself in early adult life, which you describe in your book. It's easy to sort of see it more theoretically, and it sounds horrible, but the actual human cost is really hard to appreciate unless you really hear the story.
Yeah, no, that's my sense too. And that's partly the motivation for writing the book, was to, child sexual abuse is such a taboo subject. We don't talk about it. And certainly male sexual abuse, I think, is even more so. And so because we don't talk about it, we don't have a thick description, a deep understanding.
Yes.
The cost is somebody who goes through that. And people who have endured that kind of trauma feel shame because we can't bring it out into the light of day. It's something we're not supposed to talk about. And so all of the challenges and difficulties we feel because of that abuse, we just hold it in shame and hold it in the shadows. And I wanted to create an opportunity of, we need to validate the experience of this and bring it out in the open and talk about it.
Right.
So we can understand it more. but also we don't have to be doomed to the chaos of that. I mean, it's not
Right.
just the story of being abused, it's the story of recovering from
Right.
abuse. All of the ways I found to live a beautiful life. I mean,
Right.
30, 40 years ago when I was in a mental hospital, I never would have dreamed that I could have functional relationships and a thriving vocation and inner peacefulness. And how
Right.
I got from there to here is the story of the book.
Right. Right. And not to tell the whole story of the book, but you didn't get on the road to recovery just from a 10-step process from a book.
Right.
It was a journey, and I think that's true of the healing process in general. It seems to me, I've been a student of psychology my whole life. I was formerly in an earlier part of my life, and it feels like there's always been a school of thought that we're all kind of like really enraptured by, and we try, we follow that, and we adopt the language of that
Mhm.
school of thought, but it never seems to, it's never really the full answer. And we've definitely learned some things. Science has brought things to light. We definitely know more about ourselves now.
Mhm.
But for you, it was a combination of a lot of these things. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, wouldn't it be nice if there were just, 10 steps and here you can heal from trauma and you could do it over a weekend, right? Or intensely or something like that. And
Yeah.
that's just not the case. I mean, you know, recovery from abuse is a long haul. It takes a long time. And for me, it wasn't just one thing. It was a combination of things. I mean, I really felt like I was, on a quest to try anything and everything, whether it was therapeutic massage to primal scream therapy to art therapies and contemplative practices and praying with my wounds and mindfulness practices and as many different things as you could imagine. I mean, that's my vocation. I teach spirituality and spiritual formation, so I teach practices that contribute to psycho-spiritual wholeness, and it comes out of my journey. I've tried everything I could find. Some things just didn't work at all. Some things were dead ends. Some things opened up some part of it, but it was a combination of a number of things that on the whole journey that really worked together to bring me to the place where I am today.
Yeah. Well, in your title, where you teach, you talk about narrative pedagogy. What is that? Did I even say that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Narrative pedagogy. It's just a fancy word for how stories can be educational and healing. That's really all it means. But I'm a big believer in story. I mean, we are constituted by stories, and the importance of telling our story to be seen and to be heard, and but also to find narratives that can guide us as we are trying to navigate our own lives in healing ways. And I'm hoping that this book is one of those narratives. I mean, this is an odyssey. This is a
Yeah.
journey, a quest that I went on, and it's kind of epic. Like you say, it's a
Yeah.
long book. It's an epic quest.
Yeah.
But the narrative that I hope will tap into the stories that people experience themselves and offer them a way of framing them in a way that can lead to some healing and liberation.
Not that we have time to kind of explain the whole process, but you use scripture in some of your meditative practices, stories from Holy Scripture, from the Bible. Um, talk about that, because that's actually getting into story, not so much prescriptive direction from our scriptures, but story from our scriptures. Talk about that and how that was helpful.
Yeah, well, and actually that comes from Ignatius's spiritual exercises, which
Mhm.
are an intensive spiritual journey that invites people to actually enter into the gospel stories and kind of be able to encounter the presence of the sacred, the presence of Jesus, or whatever sacred presence meets us in these stories. So, instead of kind of doing a Bible study on being out in the sea in the middle of a storm, it's actually, what if we imagined ourselves in the midst of my circumstances of today? What is the storm I'm living in? And then what would happen if Jesus were actually to come and encounter me in the midst of that? So it's a powerful way of meditating and encountering a sacred resource that's healing and soothing and restorative. And
Mhm.
so I did the entire spiritual exercises, and this is a component of the book where I entered into all the various stories of Jesus's whole life, the gospel of Jesus's life, but I did it from the perspective of an abuse survivor. So what is good news about these stories to somebody who's lived through trauma? And what would it be like for a sacred presence like Jesus to encounter one in the midst of the trauma that one is experiencing? And it was profoundly life-changing for me.
Yes. You in the description of the book, we talk about how you came upon a process of doing imaginative prayer, and we use the phrase that spiritual seekers and practitioners will find utterly fascinating, and that was my experience. It was utterly fascinating. I mean, you go deep. You go into some, kind of, to say it in kind of a slang word, almost trippy sorts of experience, meditative sessions. Talk about what you mean by imaginative meditation.
Yeah, well, so this is something that I really got from Jung, right? And Jung, who was suffering from severe depression early in his career after he broke up with Freud, was doing various things to try to manage that, and finally said, "Well, what would happen if I imagine in my imagination entered into my depression, and imagine my depression even as a figure or an image of my inner world?" And it just opened him up into an enormous journey that he developed a practice called active imagination around.
Mhm.
And so reading about that, it kind of gave me the courage. Well, all of the cacophony of a sexual abuse survivor, with the rages, the shames and self-loathing, the impulses to cut, the suicidality, what if all of those figures of my inner world, what if I did what Jung did and tried to imagine them as entities and figures, and see, kind of like Jacob wrestling with the angel. What if I actually spent time with them and tried to understand them, and why are they so powerful, and how could we develop a relationship with them? And it led me into this imaginative process of personifying the states of my inner world and then engaging them
Yeah.
in the direction of trying to have healing and compassion and understanding. And remarkably, as we tend to those inner cacophonies with compassion and curiosity, they respond. I mean, they communicate to us what it is that they're feeling and what they need, and what where they come from, and what kind of healing would help them kind of become restored. And it could feel trippy sometimes, but it's an extraordinarily rich interior journey.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. We should wrap up with maybe just a couple more questions here, but I'd love to just keep going, and I wish I could tell people more about it. But you know what? They've got to read the book. I think that's what's got to happen. Who do you want to read this book? Who are you writing for as you put this together?
Well, I mean, the answer to the question, who am I writing for?
Yeah.
My sister actually grew up in the same family, obviously, and suffered much of the same abuse. And she was, kind of a, Meg Ryan homemaker. She was not one who, went to therapy or did a lot of interior work. But when she was, in her 40s, then it all erupted in very similar ways: nightmares and cutting and self-destructive behavior. And she ended up being institutionalized, and from the institution called me to come up and be with her. And she asked me, "So Frank, you were like me, 30 years ago, you were institutionalized, you were possessed by all of this, and how did you get better?" And at the time, there's only so much I could say. I said, "Linda, we got good help, and we're going to find you good help, and really it's going to, we can do that." And within 4 weeks, she took her own life. And
Mm.
and so part of the impulse of this book was I'm writing it for Linda. It's what I wish I could have been able to communicate to Linda, and then not only by Linda, but all abuse survivors. I mean, so the first audience for me, I hope, would be people who've suffered through trauma, any kind of trauma, but certainly sexual abuse, and men who've suffered abuse, to let them know that they're not alone, that people have been in this space before, and that we're not doomed to the suffering that was inflicted upon us, that we can find ways to navigate this. And here are some of the things that I discovered along the way. So I would love for anyone who experiences suffering, trauma, and abuse. I'm writing for them. Here are some resources from one who's been there and is on that journey. And then anyone who companions people like that or wants to be able to understand our journeys for them as well. And finally, like you said, we're all on the continuum. I mean, certainly there are forms of abuse and trauma that are egregious, that not everybody experiences, but we all know suffering. And we've all found our ways of defending against that suffering. And we all get at the mercy of our different emotions and impulses. And we can all use resources to, in the midst of that, how can I come back home to myself? How can I heal from the wounds? How can I really live out of the best me that I yearn to and connect with people in the ways that I long for? I hope it's a resource for those folks.
Right, right. As well as it explains the sort of spiritual innovation work that you've done, combining a lot of things together, as you've said, and even from a religious point of view, we should say, like you're not shying away from bringing in sacred story, ancient sacred story, even, but holding it in a different way than perhaps so many of us have been raised with, and being able to see our faith in a time that feels kind of very fractious politically and religiously, and time when that feels as though, you know, the supernatural does it really exist? Is it really something there? You're able to kind of like speak in a different orbit entirely. And I think it's just something that has been there all along, but we've somehow, you know, not been able to find our way into it very well.
Yeah, very much. It's a spiritual journey, to be sure. And in more ways, a search to find a credible God, a search to find, is there a sacred resource out there that makes sense in the midst of abuse and suffering and trauma, and so many of the God images, so many of the things that we are taught in religious institutions just are not credible when you're talking to somebody who's an abuse survivor. Right. And what kind of sacred companion really meets us in the deepest places of our suffering and can companion us to genuine restoration? And my deepest discovery is that there is a sacred resource at the heart of creation that meets us in the places of our deepest pain. And the essence of that sacred reality is nothing but compassion. Yes. Nothing but compassion. And hence the title of the book. I mean, in the end, we are all cradled in the arms of compassion, and knowing ourselves held in a sacred presence that can meet us in any horror we are living within, and companion us in ways that genuinely bring life and restoration. That's a spiritual journey that, I can describe in some detail.
I'm going to indulge us in one more question with a behind-the-scenes publishing story between the two of us. And that is that the original title we thought was going to be My Sister's Pietà. And we do have a definition of a pietà in the book, and you make reference to it throughout the book. In particular, I will say to readers, check out what Frank says about Vincent van Gogh's Pietà. It is extremely revealing and moving, both in relationship to him as well as your own story. But what is a pietà for those who don't know right off the bat?
Yeah, pietà is that sacred image of Mary, the mother of Jesus, holding the dead body of Jesus after it's been taken down from the cross. And so it's become, Michelangelo's Pietà is the famous one in St. Peter's in the Vatican. But it's become a symbol of the maternal face of God that holds with compassion all of us, all suffering, even death, even the death of her own child, that she can hold that with care and
weeping, holding you with compassion and weeping.
Exactly, weeping with compassion. And so those of us who are in places of suffering, even to the point of death, who can connect with, having been tortured and abused, there is this sacred maternal presence that holds us even in the midst of that. And that's profoundly restorative.
Well, thank you so much. This is great. I know we could keep going for sure.
Oh, so generative, David.
For those who stuck around this long, and I bet many have, how do we reach you at your Compassion Center for Engaged Compassion website?
Center for Engaged Compassion website, or at the Claremont School of Theology faculty page. My email is there as well.
Do you
F.
have
Rod-
to like, do you have to
yeah.
put like limits on how many people can join your classes? Because I bet you they
Come, all are welcome. It's like the kingdom of God. All are welcome. It's
are
good.
awesome. Awesome. I think I'm coming myself. So